Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and we are very, very glad you are here with us today. I think you're going to really enjoy this presentation. Before we get started, a few announcements and upcoming talks and events. First of all, I do want to give a special thank you to all those who have made financial contributions to Montgomery History. Your support allows us to continue to offer free programs like this. And to those who have given, we are extremely grateful. If you would like to make a donation, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the Donate Now button. That will guide you through the process of making a donation. It's very easy, and we appreciate it. Okay, during the presentations, if you have any questions or any technical questions, please use the Q&A button. That will come to me, and the questions, we'll do a Q&A period at the end, and then I will handle any technical questions that may arise. Let's see, what else do I have to tell you? Okay, this Saturday at the Stone Street Museum of 19th Century Medicine, Clarence Hickey, who is our regular reenactor for Dr. Edward Stone Street, will be there giving office hours, talking about medical education in the 19th century. He will have some hands-on activities for younger visitors, and if you're really nice and you're an older visitor, he might let you participate as well. I think you should check that out. That's this coming Saturday from 12 to 4. I think you'll really enjoy that. Clarence is always a pleasure to interact with and has just a ton of knowledge that is worth gaining and listening to him talk about. Next Tuesday, we'll be having a special spooky season Halloween presentation with Karen Lottis. Will be presenting on her book, In Search of Ghosts, Montgomery County, Maryland. I have not actually seen this one yet myself, but I've heard some fantastic feedback from people who have given this presentation. I am really excited for it. I think you will enjoy it. That's next Tuesday, October 19th at 2 p.m. Please sign up. You can sign up on our website. If you get our emails, the link is in our email. If you would like to sign up on our website, go to montgomeryhistory.org, click on MH Online, and then select watch, and that will take you to the page. And then the week after that, we'll be joined by Suzanne Johnson and Tara Tetrault. We'll be talking about some of the archaeology of Sugar Land. If you attended the 2021 history conference, we had a presentation on the book that was released by the Sugar Land Ethnohistory Project. This is a little bit more of the hands-on kind of exploration of some of the archaeological work that's been done there. And I think you should definitely, if you're into archaeology or interested in historical objects, I think you should join in. I think you're going to really enjoy that presentation. And that is Tuesday, October 26th at 2 p.m. Okay, I believe that is all I have. I would like to go ahead and introduce Ranger Robert Ambrose, who I believe is here. Are you ready, Robert?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let me get with you.
Okay.
There's that.
Okay.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming out to this. Today, we're going to do a program that I'm going to share here in just a second called Fort Frederick, 3 Centuries of History. A little bit of sort of what to expect as we go along. We're going to learn about why Fort Frederick came to be. We're going to spend a lot of time focusing on its story during the French and Indian War when it was built, and then its other roles in history in the American Revolution, the Civil War, its time as a farm owned by a African-American family, and it's when it was restored by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. So without further ado, I'm going to try to share this, and we'll get started. All right. as I said, Fort Frederick, 3 centuries of history. The image here is of the fort from 1877. It was drawn by David Hunter Strother of the Harper's Weekly, famous artist correspondence of his time, and he did a really nice series of images of the fort, what it looked like as a farm in the fall of 1877, about this time, October, November. All right. Advance my screen. So before we can talk about Fort Frederick itself, we have to understand why it was built and what its era was. In the 17th and 18th century, we have 2 major powers in North America that are going to clash repeatedly, and that is France and Great Britain. Of course, Great Britain has the colonies that run from Georgia to Maine, basically along the East Coast. The French have colonies in what we now know as Canada and Louisiana, and are kind of running some outposts along what's the sort of the Mississippi River. Both territories need to expand. The English need to move west because they've got so many people in the colonies for expansion, and the French want to expand north and south. Their expansion is a little different because they don't have as many people, but they really want to open up the Ohio River Valley for trade with the American Indians and with places to put forts and trading posts and that stuff of that nature. So because you have these forces going west and you have forces going north and south, they're eventually going to collide in armed conflict. I always think of it as an intersection where there's no stop sign. Everybody just kind of eventually comes together. Nobody's paying attention, and they clash. Both the French and the English both think they have claims to all of North America, in particular this land in the Ohio River Valley. Of course, the people that are caught in the middle of this are the American Indians, who have the rights to the land with much better claim than the interlopers from Europe. So as this goes on, in the 18th century, there's a lot of different things that happen. The French try to lay some claims in the 1740s with Celeron de Blainville. In 1753, the young man pictured here in the lower right-hand corner, George Washington, is sent by Governor Dinwiddie from Williamsburg up into Western Pennsylvania to ask the French to leave. They've built some forts up along Lake Erie in that area, and he tells them to take a hike. They politely tell him, get lost. This doesn't sit well, of course, with the governor. It doesn't sit well with the British government. And in the summer of 1754, efforts are made now militarily to control the forks of the Ohio. When I say the forks of the Ohio, I mean what is now present-day Pittsburgh, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny River come together to form the Ohio. And that was pictured in the previous slide. In early 1754, a guy by the name of William Trent and some Virginians tried to build a small fort at the point at what's now Pittsburgh. He's only got a few men. The French show up with several hundred men and, again, politely ask him to leave, which he does because he doesn't have the manpower to restrain that. In the meantime, Colonel Washington and his Virginia militia or Virginia regiment and some British troops are marching west to try to reinforce Trent. They don't know that he has been kicked out yet. In May, they reach a spot near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, known as the Great Meadow, and there Washington's Indian ally, the Half King, tells him that there are French troops nearby. Washington takes his men and his Indian allies, and they either ambush them, the French, or a battle ensues. It depends on which story you hear, but whatever happens, Washington's men have the advantage, pretty much wipe out the French force minus a few that escape, and they have captured the French commander, Lieutenant Jumonville. While Jumonville is on the ground, the Half King walks up to him and says, "You are not yet dead, my white father," and slams him in the head with a tomahawk, killing him, showing that he is no longer beholden to the French and that he is allied with the English. This is going to cause Washington a great deal of issue. Washington falls back to the Great Meadow and builds a fort of necessity, the picture as you see pictured here. The French show up to do battle with Washington. Washington tries to draw them out into the open, into a European-style fight. the French and their Indian allies are having none of it. And the French will stay up, as you can see in this picture in the background, the hillside with the trees. They were back up there basically firing into Washington's fort and his entrenchments. It's a pouring down rain. And after basically fighting all day, casualties mounting, the water filling up the trenches, muskets not working, Washington is given a chance to surrender by the French. Washington does not speak French. His translator is a Dutchman who may not have been very good at speaking French either, because in the surrender document, they misread or seeing the line that says Washington was l'assassin of Jumonville. So saying that he murdered Jumonville. Washington surrenders. He's given all of the honors of war, allowed to march out with his troops, his guns, his flags, and he retreats back to Wills Creek, which is now Cumberland, Maryland. In the meantime, the French publish this publicity coup that they have, saying that Washington has killed this French diplomat, as they were calling him. He may have been on a diplomatic mission. He may not have been. That's still up for debate. And this is spread far and wide and really sets off the powder keg of the French and Indian War. 1755, the British try again to capture the forks of the Ohio, and this time a 2,000-man force under the command of General Edward Braddock, with 2 regiments of British troops, as well as Virginians, North Carolinians, and Maryland soldiers move west to try to capture Fort Duquesne. They get within a few miles of the fort on July 9th, 1755. The French know they're coming, and apparently the French force that comes out to reconnoiter the English runs headlong into the lead elements of the British column, and a battle ensues. For over 3 hours, the 2 forces collide. Before the battle takes place, because the column is moving so slow, Braddock splits his forces at the behest of a young Colonel Washington, and he takes 1,000 of his 2,000 troops in a flying column ahead of the rest of the army with the main artillery and supplies and things like that. So during this 3-hour battle, there are 1,000 British and colonial troops engaged. 900 of them end up being killed, wounded, or captured. General Braddock wounded severely. Colonel Washington has 7 musket ball holes in his clothes, has several horses shot out from under him, but comes out unscathed. The remnants of the force, which is not much, retreat back to the Great Meadow, with Braddock succumbing to his wounds and being buried in the road, and the army to march over it in order to obfuscate any trace of where he was buried, so that he could not be desecrated by the enemy. Once the British retreat to Fort Cumberland, Maryland, they decide that they do not have the strength nor the supplies to go on the offensive again, and the British regular troops retreat to Philadelphia and set up winter quarters in August. This leaves the defense of Western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia up to their colonies themselves. The man who is in charge of the defense of Maryland is this gentleman here, Governor Horatio Sharp. Governor Sharp had been a British military officer before his time as Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Maryland. And he has been wanting to do a lot to defend the colony from the get-go. He's raised a small company of troops. He's tried to raise supplies. He's tried to strengthen the militia laws. He's even supplied troops to join what will become the 60th Regiment of Foot, the British Royal Americans. But after the defeat of Braddock, he steps into high gear. The first thing he does is he has a small stockaded fort built in the Tenalloway Creek, called Fort Stoddard or Fort Tenalloway at what's now Hancock, Maryland, and has a small group garrisoning that fort. He has troops out patrolling the countryside looking for French and Indian raiders, because while Braddock's army was on the march west, American Indian and French troops came behind them and started attacking the settlements, and that would cause quite a stir. He also plans to build a much more substantial fort at the Forks of the Potomac, known as Old Town Maryland today. because he felt that that was a good place. It put it at a far enough distance away from Fort Cumberland that they could support each other. So it had Fort Cumberland, about 16 miles east, is going to be this large fort that he wants to build. And then he's going to have Fort Tenalloway and Hancock, as well as some other small forts under what's known then as the North Mountain, or Fairview Mountain, near Clear Spring, Maryland today. He wants this fort to be the major base of operations to serve against the French, and he wants to use it to defend the backcountry inhabitants, which he knows there are many people that live beyond the settlements, as they were known. So here's a map. I'm not really going to go over all the details. You can read it, but the idea is that these are the forts that are built by civilians in the military in Western Maryland and some in southwestern or south central Pennsylvania. The main ones that we've talked about so far is Fort Cumberland. You see Stoddart, and we're eventually going to get to Fort Frederick. Outside of Fort Frederick, you'll see Mills, Killall, Shelby, and Baker. Those will play a prominent role in the story of Fort Frederick as sort of outer defenses for that fort, and where soldiers from Fort Frederick can patrol to and have a safe place to stay. Conacajig is Williamsport, Maryland, and is the main sort of settlement of the time. All along the Conacajig Creek in Maryland up into Pennsylvania is kind of considered the end of the Maryland settlements. He knows that Fort Tenalloway and the few troops that he has, about 70, 80 men on hand, aren't going to be enough to defend the colony. And he goes to the Maryland Assembly and asks them to fund a supply bill of 40,000 pounds for defense. 11,000 pounds would be used to build the fort, which would be Fort Frederick, maintain a garrison for that fort. 25,000 pounds would be used for the campaign against the French, mainly money that they would give to the British to supply the next campaign. 3,000 pounds for treating with the Southern Indians, meaning presents, things to entice them to join our side as at the time, and 1,000 pounds to pay for bounties for enemy scalps, which was also used. So having the money to treat with the Indians was a big deal. And also, we're going to try to build this fort. It takes months of arguing between the lower house, the upper house, and the governor to finally get his supply bill passed, and that is passed in May of 1756. Now, Fort Frederick, as we know, was built of stone, as it still stands today. And here is a little bit parts of a quote to explain why Governor Sharp thought a stone fort was important. Governor Morris informs me that Fort Granville was attacked and burnt by a body of French assisted by a number of Indians. The fort, which I have been building on the Potomac and upon the North Mountain, we face the bastions and curtains with stone, and shall mount on each bastion a 6-pounder. Some of our patriots, he's talking about the Maryland Assembly, have intimated to their constituents that a staccato fort, a wooden fort, would have been sufficient and might have been built at much less expense. However, I persuade myself that this accident, which has happened in Pennsylvania, will incline those gentlemen to change their opinion and convince them that the excessive frugality is not always the best economy. So Fort Granville, which was a very large, supposedly strong wooden fort in Pennsylvania, is burned, the garrison massacred. And now we can say, look, I built a stone fort. We're building a stone fort. You complained it's too expensive, but you can't burn it down. It's going to be very strong, and it's going to become the good use. Construction of the fort begins in June 1756 with Governor Sharp himself literally coming out to oversee the construction of the fort, because there are no British military engineers to oversee the construction. The quote here kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that were being used to build the fort, but the main takeaway here is that wages were paid to carpenters, masons, miners, and laborers. This is not a soldier-built fort like the stockade wooden forts. This is a professionally built fort built by contractors. So this is very important. It's very different than most forts of the time. It's a very large fort as well. And so it's being built by professionals, not soldiers themselves. The soldiers are needed to protect the workers. With the fort, there was only one large entrance at the south end with a gate. The walls itself around the fort are actually 2 individual stone walls, as you can see from that picture. And there was a dirt and gravel rubble fill in between. The walls are 3 to 4 feet wide. There's no evidence outside of the fort there were any ditches or moats or anything of that nature. That it was just what you see today is what was there. The fort itself is large. It encloses an acre and a half of land. It's 360 feet from bastion tip to bastion tip. Those are the arrowhead points on the end of the fences. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And it's a very large fort. Most frontier forts at the time could fit between our barracks. Duquesne, Cumberland, you name it. They were so small compared to ours that they could fit inside of our fort. How was the fort defended? One of the biggest questions we get at the fort, because our fort is not set up for defense as it was. But if you look at this diagram, it'll give you some idea of how it was defended. We face the bastions and curtains with stone. So we have the wall on the outside that is stone, the facing. On the inside, there would be earth and fill with a horizontal log retaining wall behind it. And it would have been about 16 feet wide. And this would have been in the 4 bastions and potentially all the way around the fort. And then you would have mounted a cannon in each one of the corners, a 6-pounder, as in the picture here, that could be used to defend the fort. They could fire an iron ball up to a half a mile. The barracks are unique in this fort. There are 2 barracks like the picture here, each one built to accommodate 100 men or 1 company of Maryland troops. It could be double that in times of emergency. Each building was made up of 6 large squad rooms. Large squad rooms being a room, as pictured lower right, that would house 16 men or 2 squads of 8. So 2 men sharing each bed, 4 per bunk. Each squad has its own dining table and its own fireplace to cook. And basically, this is your home. This is where you're going to do everything you would do at home when you're at the fort. And this was pretty unique. Glass windows, double porches, clapboard siding, wooden floors. Everybody's got a fireplace. This is pretty nice. Most buildings and forts are supply buildings, and the soldiers would sleep in tents outside and not be in nice bunks and barracks like this. There was a 3rd building in the fort. It's the outline where the arrow is pointing. It was called the governor's house. It was the officers' quarters and storehouse for the fort. As one account says, was built with some taste, having arched windows and doors. It's built in the Palladian style. It's the front-facing public face of the fort. It was the building you would see as you walked in. It would be where you would meet with the fort adjutant to try to find if you needed to meet with an officer or to find out where to put your supplies or whatever would be going on. So the one side is basically where the officers would live. The other side is where the supplies were kept. The headquarters in the middle, again, a 2-story building built similarly, but nicer than the 2 enlisted men's barracks. Another unique feature of the fort was the flag. Fort Frederick had a flag that was ordered by Governor Sharp that was black and yellow, 24 feet long, 16 feet wide, with the Union in one corner. So the black and yellow of the Calvert colors, as in Maryland's flag today, with the British Union in the corner, upper field, letting folks know that this is a British colonial fort. This is a huge flag, would have been probably on a 60 to 70 foot pole, a ship's mast, and it would have been flown on special occasions or if the fort was under attack, but wouldn't have been flown all the time. But this flag is only flown at Fort Frederick as far as we know. It's the only place that it's been referenced to exist. Fort was defended by 5 companies of uniformed, paid professional provincial soldiers. It was also at times garrisoned by the Maryland militia, and again, the 4 6-pounder cannon. The Maryland provincial soldiers would have been dressed similarly to the men in the top image. Red coats, single-breasted, with black cuffs, red breeches, and the other basic military attire of the day, the cocked hat and woolen stockings. Civilian militia, the Maryland militia, would have worn the clothes on their back from home. There were a lot of other people that made the fort go. There were women, 4 women for each company of Maryland soldiers who served as laundresses for the troops, who lived in the barracks in segregated quarters, earned a wage and rations, as soldiers would have as well. There were women serving as nurses and officiating as cooks for the officers. These potentially could have been the same women who were the laundresses because those roles were interchangeable, but they could have been different as well. There was a commissary, Dr. David Ross. There was a baker, a gunsmith or armorer. There was a surgeon. There were bateaumen, or men who would float flat boats up the Potomac with supplies. There were men who made coffins for soldiers from Pennsylvania, North Carolina, who died at the fort in 1758. There was George Ross, who apparently lived nearby, who had a horse rented from him by the soldiers so that a message could be taken to Carlisle. Unfortunately, the horse was shot and he was paid for the loss of the horse and the rental, but Corporal Madden did survive. There was James Kinney and Samuel Lightfoot, who were teamsters who brought supplies to the fort. There was James Long, who lived in the village of 18 houses outside the fort. We had carpenters, sawyers, masons, miners, and laborers that helped build the fort. And you had the company captains who were in charge of each individual Maryland company. Paris, Ware, Alexander, Joshua Bell, and Dagworthy. Dagworthy being the senior most captain of the five. And there were 500 or more Maryland soldiers and officers who served at the fort that we don't have listed. And some of them we know, some of them we don't know their names. So there's a lot of people that would make this fort go during its 3 years of life during the French and Indian War. Again, I'm not going to read these word for word, but the idea is Fort Frederick is never directly attacked during the French and Indian War, but it wasn't a safe place to be once you were outside of the gate. We have a guard that was shot at in March of 1757. We have a Wagner who was shot and killed within 200 yards of the fort. We have James Long's son and another man who were killed at a quarry near the fort, which was less than a mile away, apparently. So we know, yeah, there it is, about a mile away from the fort. So it's not super safe outside the fort. The horse shot out from under the rider. So the fort is a very safe place. In modern terms, when we talked about Iraq, we had the green zone in Baghdad. This is sort of a green zone. It's a safe place. But when the soldiers go out, they're always on alert. They're always on patrol. They're always on guard. One of the biggest things that happened at the fort during the French Indian War was in April of 1757, 62 Cherokee Indians arrived at the fort to try to form an alliance with the colony of Maryland. They are under the leadership of Wahatchee of Kiowa in South Carolina and Yaktanu of Chota, which is in Tennessee today. They had walked from those places to Virginia, went to Williamsburg, and then walked all the way to Fort Frederick and would eventually form an alliance with us. Their interpreter would be Richard Paris, the same Richard Paris who is also one of our company captains. When they show up and they form this alliance with Maryland, Governor Sharp asks them to do one thing. He says, "Let our men go out to war with you. Look on them as brethren. Teach them to fight after your manner." So he is telling them to teach the Maryland soldiers, the provincial troops, to not fight like Europeans, but to fight and track like American Indians. And the alliance is formed, and it lasts for about a year before the Cherokee finally decide to go back home in the summer of 1758. And it will pay off as the Maryland soldiers are used as rangers or as Indians during the Forbes campaign to do the tracking and scouting out in front of General Forbes's army that's going to capture Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne falls in the fall of 1758. And by the spring of 1759, the fort is closed, the gate is locked, and it's put under the care of Dr. Henry Heinzman, who was the surgeon, and he is there as the caretaker. 1763 and 64, it is reopened during Pontiac's Rebellion, which was an American Indian uprising at the end of the French and Indian War, when Ottawa Chief Pontiac gets many other tribes, many other bands of American Indians to rise up against the British, to fight with them, because the British did not treat the American Indians after the war as victorious allies. They treated them as defeated people, and that upset them, as it should. Well, during this time, the attacks begin and all over, from as far away as Green Bay, Wisconsin to Bedford, Pennsylvania, and the fort is reopened, and over 700 local inhabitants and militiamen take refuge in the fort during that time, off and on, during the summer of 1763 and into 1764. Pontiac's rebellion is finally put down at the Battle of Bushy Run, pictured at the bottom. In the fall of 1763, that's really when it ends, but there's still some lingering effects on there. But in 1764, the fort is closed again. 1778 to 1783, Fort Frederick is reopened, this time as a prisoner of war camp to house captured British prisoners. The Americans need places to house British prisoners, particularly those of the Convention Army and others, because there is no exchange with Great Britain, because if the colonies or the United States exchange prisoners with Great Britain, the government, and vice versa, that would mean that Great Britain was recognizing American sovereignty and American nationhood, so they could not do this. So we began to have to hold on to all of these prisoners. Fort Frederick was considered a good place to put them because of its stone walls, its barracks, and its distance away from the coast. So we have prisoners brought here from the Convention Army, aka the British Army captured at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. We also have a large number of prisoners brought up from Cornwallis's surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, among others. And during its time, thousands of British prisoners are held at the fort. It is so crowded. And this letter here, the excerpt says it pretty well. It gives you the numbers of troops that were brought in on top of what was already there: 438 men, 145 women, 206 children, and with these 70 sailors. The fort is pretty full. The fort is so full that the prisoners are in the barracks. They have built huts on the parade field along the perimeter of the fort, and they have even built huts on the outside of the walls for the married soldiers with families to stay, because they know they aren't going to try to run away, or less likely to run away from the fort. So there are just people everywhere. There's logistical issues everywhere. Food, clothing, sanitary conditions are all bad, and they're not good for the soldiers who are there guarding them either, which were a mix of state troops and militia. And at one time, at the beginning of the war, Colonel Moses Rawlings, Maryland, Virginia Rifle Regiment. But Moses Rawlings would stay on as the commandant throughout the war, and it is quite the place to be. And this is a story we've been trying to tell a little more, because it's a longer time in use than the French and Indian War, and it's also such a bigger story and connects very closely with so many major people and major issues of the American Revolution. After the Revolution, we win our independence, and the fort is sold in 1791 as surplus property. So the fort gives it up. It goes into private hands in 1791, and it'll stay in private hands from 1791 until 1922. Its most famous, most important owner is Nathan Williams. He and his family owned the property from 1850 to 1911. Nathan had been born enslaved, but his father purchased him and his family out of slavery. Nathan would then buy his wife out of slavery, who lived nearby Fort Frederick. He would buy Fort Frederick for about $5,000 to $7,000, depending on which court record you read. And he does this all before the Civil War. The ink's dry in 1860. He dismantles the northwest bastion of the fort to build a barn, and he uses the interior of the fort for grape arbors and pigsty and other agricultural uses. And he has a very big farm, 200 acres, I believe. And it's considered a very thrifty farm, a very prosperous farm. And he's a very important figure. He was able apparently to pay off his loan to the bank in 7 years. And they say that was partly according to his family, because during the American Civil War, he was selling food to both the Union and the Confederacy, as well as apparently doing some spying for the Union as well. His loyalty is even brought into question because of his relationships with the Confederates in terms of taking them and selling them supplies, but he's able to dodge that bullet. He's also important because he's in the Republican politics at the time. In the 1870s, he's a member of the state convention to nominate legislators and the governor and things. And also his biggest contribution is that he's involved in early African-American education. In 1870, he is named, 1875, sorry, he is named trustee of the Fort Frederick School for Colored Children, as it was known. The school takes place in several different places, apparently even maybe his son's house. Eventually in 1898, a new schoolhouse is built, which still is on park property today, and we are in the process of restoring it. His wife deeded that property to the county for the school after Nathan's death, because he had died in 1882, and two of his children are teachers at this school during the time, and both went to Storer College, one of the first schools for African Americans. It's in Harpers Ferry National Park today. So they're a very interesting story, and they're a whole program into themselves. But they have the property until 1911. They sell the property, it changes hands once or twice during that time. And also, backing up a little bit, while the Williamses lived at the fort, the American Civil War erupts. The Williams house is literally a half a mile from the north shore of Virginia at the time of the Confederacy. They are literally living on the border. And during the time of the Civil War, Union troops do come to the fort, particularly in the winter of 1861-62. And the Union Army is trying to protect the C&O Canal, the fords and ferry crossings, as well as trying to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is in Virginia at that time, from the Maryland side. And several skirmishes take place at the fort in the fall of and winter of 1861 and 62. There's 3 or 4 of them that happened. Nothing major, but enough that the men who were there, some of them wrote about it, and even so that one of the units actually painted in gold leaf on their flag, Fort Frederick. Other troops will be at the fort or near the fort during all the other major campaigns in the East during the war, Antietam, Gettysburg, Monocacy, all those, there will be troops in and out of the area and skirmishing nearby. So the Williams sell the property, as I said, in 1911. It changes hands a few times. In 1922, the state of Maryland acquires the property in 189.5 acres from the Board of Forestry to create one of Maryland's first state parks. The mission of the Board of Forestry, which was at the time part of the University of Maryland, was to do forest stuff. Forestry as in like planting and also selling lumber, those kind of things. Fort Frederick had literally no trees. And during its early efforts, they make an experimental forest at the fort with the help of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And some of the trees that do not belong in Western Maryland, their children and grandchildren are still there today, including things like cypress and loblolly pines. And there's a cedar tree that only grows in the West, typically in the park as well, among others that you can find. So if you ever come to Fort Frederick and you notice there's some funky trees, that's why. In 1934 to 37, Civilian Conservation Corps come and they restore the fort walls. They do archaeology. They build the majority of the park we see today. When you come there, the roads, the log buildings, the picnic pavilion, all of that was done by the Civilian Conservation Corps. After their time, during the Great Depression, when they're there, this is one of the alphabet soup agencies of the FDR administration. After they're there, the park sort of just kind of goes into autopilot for a while until the 1960s, when the 1st Maryland Regiment of Revolutionary War reenactors starts doing regular living history programs. And we've been doing regular living history programs ever since. So a pretty long time to have costume interpretation going on. 1976, for the bicentennial of the United States, the barracks buildings at Fort Frederick were rebuilt, the 2 enlisted men's barracks that you see today, and you can come out on weekends in the fall and during the summer, during the week as well, and see programs and come in and tour those buildings. But if it was not for the Great Depression and the Civilian Conservation Corps, we wouldn't be where we are today. If they wouldn't have done the work that they did, Fort Frederick may have continued to crumble and just become a nice little place to go and picnic or camp once in a while. We have a campground, we have a picnic area, we have some boating opportunities, fishing opportunities, we have a number of hiking opportunities as well. So even if you're not a big history person, we've got lots of little things to do at Fort Frederick to keep you going. So that concludes the history of Fort Frederick. But as you can see from this picture, the walls are what was restored by the CCC. The 2 barracks buildings were rebuilt in the 1970s. If you look off to the left background is where our visitor center is. It was built in the early 1980s. And but the thumbprint of the CCC is all over this park. Nathan Williams' house, just as another point of reference, off to the almost middle left at the edge of the screen, just off the screen, is where his house was at the time. And so he farmed all of that area you see today. With that, I hope you guys enjoyed the program. I hope you come out and visit us at Fort Frederick State Park, and I'll be waiting for the Q&A session.
Okay, let me get my camera turned on here. Okay, and there I am. Okay, all right. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. We did get one, a couple that have come in here. I'm gonna start out. Robert, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about Fort Frederick that you didn't know before you started working there?
Oh, I've learned so much. That's a tough one. I've visited Fort Frederick many times as a child, growing up. I even in college ran a cross country meet here. So I've been at the fort many, many times. But I've learned a ton about the fort. There's so many stories that are interesting. Again, it goes back to the fact it's the only stone fort built by the British or a British colony at this time. Yes, there's some stone forts in North America, but they're all built by the French. So that makes it very unique. The story of the Williams family and it just continues to slowly unfold, is so interesting and special that we have them involved. And I don't know. I've gotten such an appreciation for different parts of our history that I hadn't before. The Civilian Conservation Corps era is near and dear to my heart, and that was something I was not really super interested in before I started working here. So there's for me, it's so many stories. I couldn't just pin one down. I just count myself lucky as being somebody that can tell the story and help preserve and protect this landmark. So that to me is the most awesome thing that I went here as a child, climbing on cannons and looking at reenactors, and now it's my turn to make sure that it continues.
Okay. All right, so we got some questions rolling in here. Were the Confederate forces involved in the skirmishes of December 1861 and January 1862, commanded by Stonewall Jackson during the Romney campaign? And then were the Union forces commanded by Frederick Lander?
In a roundabout way, yes. We don't know exactly who the Confederate forces were for 100% sure. They're either Confederate militia or they are Turner Ashby's cavalry. So they would have been ultimately under the command of Thomas Jackson during the Bath Romney campaign timeframe, because we're talking December and January. And the Union forces that are at the fort in December and January, the 1st Maryland Infantry USA under the command of Colonel Kinley. But ultimately, Lander would have control as the highest ranking officer in the area. And those Union troops that were at Fort Frederick on January 6th or 7th, I believe it is, will be forced marched to Hancock to go be under Lander's command to help repulse Jackson's potential crossing. So yeah, ultimately they are, but they're small units, that aren't really smaller units that aren't really under the specific command at that moment of those folks.
Okay. Someone asks, what is left, if anything, of Nathan Williams' house?
Nothing.
Okay.
And I'll elaborate just a little bit. There is potentially a small foundation that sits off the edge of the picture, just off the edge of the picture. Actually, you can almost see it. That may have been the kitchen of the house. We don't know. The CCC found this foundation and they capped it off. We know that the CCC tore down Williams' house, which when I realized that's what that house was, it really hurts, especially when you see the images of them tearing it down and you realize there's an 18th century structure underneath of it that potentially was germane to the fort's original occupation as well. So it's a twofer. So there's not much left. There's nothing left there. But we did a few years ago, we were putting in a new restroom facility not too far from where the house was, and we turned up a lot of artifacts related to their time period in the fort, and we're hoping to have those displayed at some point. And yeah, we need to eventually try to pinpoint the exact spot the house was, because if you look at it in photographs, it moves because of the perspective of the image. It moves ever so slightly. So someday I'd like to actually be able to pinpoint exactly where the house was perfectly and at least commemorate the house. But we have the schoolhouse, which we think is a great place to help tell their story too. But yes, it's very sad that the house is gone.
Okay, and then Alan asks, are there any plans to rebuild the governor's house?
Not anymore. There were 20 years ago. The plans fell through for lots of different reasons. And currently there just isn't anybody clamoring for it to be done, and would need funding and things of that nature. It would be a great addition to have it, and I think we could build a good replica of the building, but there's just not a lot of will at this point to do that.
Okay. What sort of items were found at the fort when the Civilian Conservation Corps archaeologists were digging? Was there anything interesting?
Most of our best artifacts come from that time period. And unfortunately, one of the things that happens is the Civilian Conservation Corps, if you're not familiar, is a multi-layered organization. The camps are run by the United States Army. And then the sites are run in conjunction with the Forest Service or the National Park Service or some other lower level organization. So ours was run by the Army, the National Park Service, and the State Board of Forestry, all working together. Well, when the CCC boys got there, and apparently they needed something for them to do, and you've got a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, and you have Army officers, and they say, you know what would be a really great idea? Let's start digging for stuff. Let's try to find the foundations of these buildings. And they just started digging trenches all over the place, and they found a ton of good stuff. The archaeologist from the National Park Service shows up after they started, and he's appalled, and he literally sits down with a blank grid map and interviews everybody that was on the digs to try to figure out where the artifacts actually came out of the ground. So they're all a little out of context, but they found cannonballs, they found horseshoes, they found ceramics, they found glassware, they found bullets, pretty much anything you would think. And most of our best artifacts from there. They found, which is really cool, a wooden canteen that was inside of the fort's well. And it's like 80% complete still today, and it has initials and whatnot on it. So a lot of our best artifacts came from those digs. Civil War bayonet and a lot of other stuff. Now, there were some digs later in the 60s and 70s and late 90s that found some other nice stuff, but the big artifacts that have been found and we display typically are those from the Conservation Corps.
Okay, you kind of hinted at it a little bit there, but what was the source of water for residents of the fort?
So you can't see it in the picture, but if you're looking at the fort there, the barracks building on the right-hand side, just beyond the north end, the upper end of it, is the original fort well. It is a 40-foot stone shafted well. It still holds potable water to this day. So it's been there since 1756. And now what's above ground has been restored, but everything 3 feet below ground is the original stonework and everything. And that's pretty cool. So that's a place where they could have got water, but because it relies on groundwater, that source is a little sketchy to use it every day. So they are more than likely going to the Potomac River to get the majority of their water, about a half a mile away, or just off the right side of this picture down the hill is a small stream that is fed by 2 or 3 small springs. So they may have been getting water from there as well, which has been a little closer than the Potomac. But I think for large quantities, they'd have been getting it from the Potomac. The well is more for small things and emergencies. If the fort's besieged and you can't get out, you use the water in the well.
Okay, so that kind of to tie into that, what that body, you can just barely see a body of water in the top left there. What direction is this picture facing? And
this picture is facing almost due north.
Okay, and what body of water is that up there?
More than likely, that is the Big Pool Lake. It's a 2-mile long lake, and that's probably the north end of the lake. The Potomac is probably off the screen, but the Potomac does make a bend around the fort. So I'm going to go with that's Big Pool because I should see 2 bodies of water if I could see the Potomac.
Okay. Where was the stone for the walls obtained?
So that's a great question. It was obtained locally. And if you look at the fort, 90% of it has never seen a hammer or a chisel. It's literally just sandstone that has been pulled out of the ground. There's a few limestones, but not much. There is the reference of a quarry being nearby within a mile of the fort, but living out in this neck of the woods, you don't have to dig down too far to find rocks. So when they say quarry, they probably dug into a hillside and just started pulling rocks out. It's not cut stone. It's not like, the Flintstones quarry with, that kind of stuff. So it's local. It's not far. Some of it's river rock because some of it's very rounded, but majority of it's coming from some sort of nearby source.
Okay. Next question I have here is, when it was used for defense, would there have been wood platforms on which soldiers stood to fire from the fort onto the enemy?
So let me see if I can go back, because I want to, it's sometimes, give me a second here. It's hard to explain it because you got to see it. And even our diagram is a little tough to understand. But looking at the diagram here, in each one of the bastions, the 4 arrowhead points, there is the stone wall on the outside. Inside of that wall, 16 feet in, is a horizontal log wall as depicted in the upper right of that image. Between the horizontal log wall and the stone wall is dirt fill. And it is done up to about 3 feet to the top of the wall so that you can defend the fort. You technically only need only two bastions to defend the entire perimeter, but 4 bastions give you a good locking crossfire on all the walls. If the fort is built correctly, and I believe it is, that's my theory, and I've been working on some research on it, I believe that that system of the horizontal logs and the earth and fill goes all the way around the fort, primarily because of the placement of the 3 buildings. They're 25, 30 feet away from the walls, and they could have been closer if they weren't. So you have plenty of room for that, that defensive posture to go all the way around. But with 200 men in the fort, you literally only need the 4 corners, because you would put roughly 50 men in each bastion, 25 pointing each direction to get that crossfire, and you've defended your fort. But as an easy way to move around, yes, I think there should be an elevated platform, but I believe it is going to be something like depicted here versus a catwalk scaffolding system.
Okay, so before we leave this slide, had a couple of people talk about or ask questions about the design of the fort.
Yes.
Is this a European fort style? Can you give a little bit more detail about, you mentioned the bastions, kind of explain a little bit more about how that would have worked.
Sure. So this is the typical Sébastien Vauban style of fort. Sébastien Vauban was a French engineer who basically came up or refined the idea of defense in depth. For years and years and years before gunpowder and cannons came along, we were building castles, and the castles were getting taller and taller and taller and taller. Cannons came along and easily decimated the walls of a castle. So they needed to become lower to the ground and thicker. So this design, 4 bastions, is pretty much the simplest version of Vauban. If you look at a good Vauban diagram, it looks like sometimes there are forts that look like the sun. It's got points all the way around, like a kid drawing a cartoon sun. So 4 is the minimum really to make this work properly, and it gives you a 360-degree field of interlocking fire. So you have a 3 to 4 foot thick wall, then 16 feet of fill with the log wall behind it. You now have a 20-foot thick wall that makes it much harder for artillery to go through. A 3-foot thick wall, a couple of shots from a well-placed 6-pounder is probably going to breach the wall. But when it's this thick, it's going to make it much harder for those folks to defend. Another thing that I talked about earlier, I mentioned that there were no outer defenses, no ditch or anything like that. It's something else that the Vauban system typically have. You dig a ditch and you throw the dirt to the outside of the ditch, which then creates kind of blocks. Here's the ditch, here's your fort. It kind of makes it harder for you to see the fort. But this is, yes, this is the European style of the day. Like I said, pretty much one of the simplest versions, 4 points. You could have 5, 6, 7, 8 ad nauseum. There are walled cities in Europe that are made in this design. Again, the 4 arrowhead points, the bastions, are your primary defenses. And the way it works is, instead of being a square, you have those arrowhead points sticking off, which then causes your enemy, in order to try to breach the wall, draws them in. And you put that crossfire on them, and it makes it devastating for them to attack. Also of note, it is roughly 60 feet from bastion point, or 60 yards from bastion point to bastion point on the outside. A good, I should say good, not good. An average soldier can accurately fire his musket and hit something at 60 yards. So you literally, it's at musket distance. Plus you have the cannons that can fire a shot over a half a mile. You're going to be well defended for a long period of time. And yes, very common form of defense.
Okay. Will there be any reenactments this fall?
No, we are done our programming season, except for we've got 3 more weekends of costume interpretation in the fort, but we have no more events planned for this year. We didn't do a ton. A couple of reasons, COVID, and also the fact that we were unable to hire. We have the same problem everybody else did, as many folks as we normally do to help us run our programming. So we'll be open for a couple more weekends. So October 31st, the last day of interpretation. And then hopefully we're going to hit it hard next year and have a full schedule of events. This year, like I said, we're able to do a few. We did a Revolutionary War program July 4th weekend. We had a unit that portrays Virginians come in and stay in the fort and do a garrison program. And we did our 1 Fort 3 Centuries program, where we highlighted the things I just talked about today, from the French Indian War to the Civilian Conservation Corps. And we've had some school groups. We've got a couple more school groups coming in, but yeah, unfortunately, just the programming season is basically done, except for coming to visit and meeting with our couple interpreters and learning about more of the details than I gave today.
Okay. What are your normal hours if somebody wants to come visit?
So right now, it is 10 to 5 Saturdays and Sundays.
Okay. And it's open entry? You don't need to have reservations or anything?
No, it's open entry. The park has a $3 per car charge if you're a Maryland resident, $5 for out of state. It's an honor system fee that you can pay. So it's not nothing too big. So as many people come in your car, it's $3 or $5. So we're pretty cheap date. But yeah, you can just come. The park is open, and you can come when we're not in the fort. You can come and walk the grounds every day and look in the windows. And we have a guided self-guided tour that you can do, one on the fort, one on the Williams family as well. So you're more than welcome to come and do those anytime, but just on the weekends right now, the doors will be open and in the buildings, and we'll have folks there to talk to you.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up there. I know there's a few questions I didn't get to, but I encourage everybody to head on up to Fort Frederick and check it out. What's the website if someone wanted to look up more information?
I would just say to use your favorite search engine and type in Fort Frederick State Park.
Okay.
We have a long government email or website. So yeah, just search us, and we'll be the first thing that pops up. And you can see what all's going on or not going on, or what you can do at the park. There's some history on there too. And we look forward to having you all come out this fall, or see you in 2022.
Okay, well, Robert, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye.